What we're going to talk about today is what happens when you start your computer. And we're going to talk about primarily Windows and Mac. They work virtually the same in terms of the startup process. There is a little bit of a difference that I'll show you at the end when we take a look at startup programs. So stay tuned for the end for a little preview of what happens with startup programs and how to find out the things that start up and run in the background when you're using your computer as well. So today's agenda will be looking at the components of what happens when you start up your computer, because people may be familiar with them. Some people probably aren't. I learned a few things when I did some research on the article and the steps it takes to start up. Once you know all the components and the pieces, the steps are pretty logical that it goes through. So these are some things we're going to review so you understand what these terms are and what they mean. A disk drive, you probably know what that is. Your operating system, another pretty common term. You probably are of an understanding of random access memory. We're going to talk a little bit about something called a UEFI and BIOS firmware chip. That is a critical part of the startup process. You may or may not be familiar with that. And then something called a bootloader, which is a special file on your hard drive that gives instructions for certain things to happen. So once you understand what these things are, it'll become pretty clear to you what's going on inside your computer when you press the power button. And we're assuming, or I'm assuming, that we're going to look at a computer when it is powered off completely, and we want to press the power button and get it started up. So the first thing is the disk drive. The disk drive saves your data and software. It stores the operating system on the disk drive, and a disk drive does not need power to keep things stored. So even if your computer is powered off, information that's on the disk drive, whether it's a platter that's a magnetic platter that rotates, or whether it's a solid state drive, it doesn't need power to keep things in memory. And so that's one of the valuable things about a disk drive, because we're going to take a look at another type of memory that does need power. But disk drives don't need power in order to store things. And that's where your operating system is kept when your computer is powered off. The operating system is Windows and Mac OS. So we have Windows, we have Mac OS. Those are the two popular ones. Every computer that powers on has an operating system of some kind, and in commercial computers, there might be things like you might have heard of Linux or Unix, or you might have heard of other types of operating systems. But I just really want to focus on Windows and Mac because they're the most popular ones. They're stored on the disk drive, and the operating system creates your desktop, and it makes it possible for you to run and use applications on your computer. So the operating system communicates with all the parts of the hardware, the memory, the internet, the Ethernet connections, the USB connectors, the display, and it creates this desktop environment that allows you to install and run applications. So in order to really have a working computer, you've got to have an operating system on it, at least from a Mac and Windows standpoint. Now, there's another type of memory I mentioned. It's called random access memory, RAM for short. It holds the software that's being used on your computer, like the operating system and applications and the data that it's working with. And your computer actually moves things between your random access memory and your disk drive as it needs to create space. But random access memory is really, really fast, but for your CPU to get to. Now, it's more expensive than a disk drive, so that typically we get computers that have things like 8 gigabytes of RAM or 16 gigabytes of RAM or 32 gigabytes of RAM. But it's expensive memory compared to storage that you can keep on a solid state or a rotating disk, but it also needs power in order to work. So if there's no power to the computer, there's no ability for random access memory to hold anything in memory. That's the difference between RAM and other types of memory on computers. Now, another component I mentioned is the UEFI and BIOS. It's a piece of firmware, which means it's software that's stored on a chip on the motherboard circuitry of your computer. BIOS is an older term, but it's still used a lot. But when they migrated about 10 years ago or so from BIOS to UEFI, some things happened. UEFI is used now because it does some checks on your computer that BIOS could not do. So you might still see the term BIOS. People might be talking about BIOS, but it's not really used anymore. It's the UEFI is really what's actually used, but it's a little chip on the motherboard of your computer that when you power on your computer and it powers on, it runs the first set of instructions for you to start the computer up. So here's what UEFI does. It checks that the hardware is working correctly. That's called a POST, a post check that's done to make sure you've got RAM, you've got a disk drive, you've got a keyboard, a mouse, a monitor, everything you might need to work your computer. Make sure it runs and says, checks the hardware is working correctly. It finds the disk drive with the operating system and makes sure the operating system is functioning correctly and hasn't been corrupted in any way. And then it starts something called the bootloader. The bootloader is a special file. I'll talk about that. So UEFI does all of these things when you power on your computer, that little firmware chip. The bootloader is, like I've illustrated here the best I could, a little area on your disk drive that's a special area that the firmware knows how to find on your disk. And the bootloader is a little tiny program that loads the operating system into random access memory. And all disk drives that with Mac and Windows have something called a bootloader, and it's the actual tiny program that says UEFI as firmware has said it's okay to go. I'm going to load the operating system into RAM, and it's just a little space that's stored in a special area of the disk drive that your firmware knows how to find and can point to when you actually power on your computer. So all these things really have been designed by engineers that make it really easy for when we put a power button, a lot of this stuff happens, but you may have never known all of this happens when you start up your computer. So let me just review a few of these terms. A UEFI firmware, it's on the motherboard. It's not part of the operating system. It performs the post hardware check and it finds the bootloader. The bootloader is not on the motherboard, it's on the disk drive, but it's not part of the operating system. But its function is to load the operating system. And then the operating system is on the drive. It is the operating system and it runs and controls your apps. So those are the terms. I want to just repeat them again so that you understand what happens. So here's the steps to startup. Now that you know all the terms, it's going to be really easy for me to describe a startup, and we'll have lots of time for Q&A afterwards. You press the power button to power on your computer. UEFI performs the post check. The UEFI starts the bootloader, and then the operating system starts and creates your desktop. Now, when you put your computer to sleep, the power is not really off. It's just in a state of suspended animation, so to speak. It's in a low power mode so that the operating system remembers everything you were doing at the time you put it to sleep, and it gives it the ability to wake up quickly. Computers with solid state drives wake up really quickly. Computers with older disk drives, platters, wake up a little more slowly because the disk drive has to start rotating for it to start up. But that's one reason why when we compute our computers to sleep, they wake up so quickly, is that the operating system has really saved everything in memory where we need it to be. Now, there's one other thing that happens after the operating system starts. Your startup programs load into RAM. And a startup program is a separate program, separate from the operating system, but it's in a space on the operating system that the operating system says, I know that as soon as I start and I load up and I create the desktop, the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to load these other programs that are part of the startup. Now, startup programs are things like that start automatically. They start after the operating system starts. They use RAM. And so that's one of the biggest concerns people have about startup programs is that are they using resources on older computers, on slower computers, on really inexpensive computers? You may not have a lot of RAM because more RAM increases the price of your computer. They run in the background. So if you have a slower CPU, they could possibly slow down your computer. And 5 years ago, 10 years ago, a lot of technicians that worked on computers would look at the startup programs and they just try and cut down everything except the critical ones that are necessary. With most modern computers, there's enough CPU power, there's enough memory that they can run in the background safely. But if you keep on loading up more and more and more and more and more, eventually you might find your computer slows down. That's the only major concern. So here's some examples of a startup program. Your antivirus program, your security and safety types things. If you have something like McAfee or Norton, it's not part of the operating system, but in order for it to protect your computer, it has to load up and run after the operating system starts. So it's important to get your antivirus protection. Cloud storage, if you use Google Cloud or iCloud or Microsoft OneDrive or other cloud storage, sometimes they will be starting up automatically so that the cloud storage and your desktop computer storage disk drive are transparent and integrated with each other. And then lots of times you'll see updaters that are part of your startup programs, updaters like Chrome operating system updaters or Adobe updaters or other applications that you might use often install updaters that update those applications all the time. And so I'm going to show you how to find them. They're actually pretty easy to find. And if you understand what it is that you're looking at when you have startup programs, you can choose and decide which ones you want to have starting up and which ones don't. So again, the process is pretty automatic when your computer starts up. This firmware checks to make sure that everything's functioning properly in the hardware. It checks the operating system to make sure it's not corrupted. It tells the bootloader then to load up the operating system. You get a desktop and you get a clean operating system loaded up. Sometimes it's worthwhile to do a full power shutdown and a full power on. That's commonly called a restart. But sometimes there can be a few things that are stored in certain areas of memory in computers when you just do a restart. And occasionally, if your computer isn't working right or you wonder if it's running slow or not, you can power off completely and do a complete power on with the power button. That'll load a clean version of the operating system, but it's also going to load up all of your startup programs. So let me change my screen sharing here to share my Windows desktop, and we'll take a look at Mac in a minute. So you should see my Windows 11 desktop, and it's pretty easy to find where the startup programs are. If you go down to the taskbar here and you right click on it, I'm going to click here, you'll right click, you'll see taskbar settings, and above it you'll see something called Task Manager. I'm going to click on Task Manager. Screen opens up with a lot of data. This is telling you everything that's really going on inside your computer. But what we want to care about is startup programs. So let's go to the left, and we're going to scroll down to this little window here. And if you hover over it, you'll get a little tooltip called Startup Apps. And if I click on that, it'll show all of the applications that are in the Startup Apps folder on my operating system that the operating system will say, oh, I'm supposed to start this up after I'm done starting myself. Now, the nice thing about the startup apps is that there is a status called enabled and a status called disabled. If you select one, like Copilot here from Microsoft, I have it enabled. And sometimes they're able to tell you what the impact is when it starts up. Sometimes they're not. Okay, so it's just a matter of what you have going on here. Now, and I'm using Microsoft Defender. That's enabled. That's my antivirus software. So I want that to start up all the time. But Microsoft 365 is disabled. Now, if I wanted to enable it, I can just select it. And at the top, there is an icon for check or a tool menu item for just clicking enable. And if I click on that, you'll see that change from disabled to enabled. Now, it won't start up the application right now, but next time I boot up my computer, it will go, and the operating system loads up, it will then load up Microsoft 365 Copilot. If I don't want something like Microsoft Teams, I rarely use that, although some people might use it more often. I can select it here and I can go up to the top here and I can click on disable. I am not uninstalling the program. That's the great thing about the startup apps area, is that you're not removing the program from your computer. So if you think, gee, is it safe to remove or not? You don't have to worry about that. You can just say, I don't want it to start up when I start up my computer. So that's one of the areas where you can look if you want to fine tune your computer a little bit. If you're getting pop-up messages from some application, usually it's because there's a little startup program that's built in there that is automatically starting up whenever you start up your computer, and it's delivering a message to you. On my Mac desktop, I've got my system settings open. I'm going to close it just so you can see what I go through. I'll go up to my Apple icon, go to System Settings, and then it'll open up the System Settings menu. On the Systems General menu here, there is a function on Macs called Login Items and Extensions. If I click on that, it'll show all the items that will open automatically when I log in and start my computer. Okay, and these are applications that I allow in the background. These are applications that perform background tasks when the application isn't even open, like checking for an update. So Camtasia, for example, which I use for my video editing frequently, that will check for updates in the background and automatically update. ChatGPT, the app, checks for updates. There's a few things you might not understand, and that's okay. If you're not sure of it, don't worry about it. My Epson printer does an update. Here's a common one, your Google Updater, which will update your Chrome operating system. So lots of times you'll have applications in here that include updaters, and this is where your OneDrive starts up. I use Parallels for running Windows and Snagit and Zoom and a few other things. And then there's the ability to add extensions to your tools as well, and they will start up. They're typically, what I have is just the standard Microsoft one. So you can see a lot of things start up, which is why computer experts recommend that you have a fair amount of RAM in your computer, because in addition to the operating system and applications, you might have some of these background tasks. If you have an older computer and you have a lot of background tasks, you're going to find that it could possibly slow down your computer. But if you have a more up-to-date computer, something 3 to 4 years old, and you bought a decent processor with a certain enough RAM in it, you may find that these background processes actually have no impact at all. And I generally recommend, if it's working, don't worry about it. So I want to just thank everybody for being really great about taking care of muting themselves and making it easy for me to record.